Hey friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you are interested in true crime or if you like all things horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. I know it's been a few weeks since I have actually posted anything. Life kind of got to be a little much, and I took some time off to work on a little bit of some advocacy projects in my hometown and in my spare time. I have a short little video over on TikTok, same username, M is for morbid, if you want to check that out. But otherwise, I do think that I am going to be back to posting pretty consistently. Now, I just had to have a short little break where I kind of just took a little bit of mental time for myself. Anyway, I did come across this case the other day, and it is another case that's relatively local to me. I was born and raised in Indiana, and I currently live in Kentucky. And this story takes place in Lexington, Kentucky, which is a couple hours from me. It's not like right next door, but it's within driving distance of me. So it's another accidental local story to me. And I'm genuinely surprised there's not more coverage on this case. And it surprises me because this isn't a serial killer. It's not like a mass murderer. This man just killed one person, which is still awful, but it's not as big or theatric as some of the other people that are commonly talked about. But what surprises me as to why this case doesn't have more coverage is because this man did essentially like a targeted assassination, like a straight up sniper rifle assassination of a college student on a college campus. And it was intentional. It was cold-blooded, and it was over the stupidest reason. And he ended up getting a plea deal that allowed him to be essentially free as of right now, which blows my mind. It is one of the, I don't want to say one of the best plea deals I've ever heard of, because obviously a murderer walking free is not the best, but in the murderer's eyes, it's one of the best deals that I have ever seen a murderer get. And I found it to be very interesting. And so today we are going to go into that story. So like I said, this story does take place in Lexington, Kentucky, and it specifically centers around the University of Kentucky, which is the home of the Kentucky Wildcats. And one of those Kentucky Wildcats is a student named Trent DeGero, and he was a football player for the University of Kentucky. And this was his third year playing football for the team. Our story takes place on July 17th, 1994, and Trent is celebrating his 21st birthday on that night. Trent goes out to the front porch where he sits in a recliner on his front porch, and he starts having conversation with his small group of friends that he invited over to his house to drink and to celebrate his 21st birthday. Now, as Trent was sitting on the porch with his friends having conversation, a loud bang rang out, and that caused all of his friends to jump up and kind of look around and see where this noise was coming from. And nobody could, decide on what made this noise or what direction it even came from. And so Trent's friends turned to look at him to see if he had any idea of what this noise could have possibly been. And when they looked at Trent, Trent would be unable to answer that question. And that's because Trent was slumped forward in his recliner with blood coming out of his ears, because Trent had been shot that day through the head, penetrating his skull and killing him on impact. Now, obviously, 911 would be called, but as luck would have it, most of the homicide department would be out of town for a training the night of Trent's shooting. And so only one homicide officer would respond this night, and that would be Detective Don Evans. And Don was still considered to be a rookie in the department. So Nothing against Detective Evans, but he wasn't the most experienced officer, and he was the only one who was able to respond. He was 28 years old at the time, and he responded, and he immediately started talking to the people there at the party. Now, it was a relatively small party as far as college standard goes for parties, but there were still about 40 or so people there. So he had quite a few people to talk to, and he figured somebody would have had to seen something. But nobody did. Nobody knew where this shot came from. Nobody saw anything. Nobody saw anybody. Now, somebody did comment earlier that there had been a vehicle that had drove by earlier on in the party, and the people inside this vehicle had been catcalling a couple of the girls there at the party, and they kind of got shooed off and shunned by the partygoers, which made the people in the car irritable, upset. But nobody saw them coming back. Nobody had seen that vehicle again. Nobody had seen the people in the car again. It wasn't a lead at all that really panned out. So the reason why no one at the party saw anything that night is because the shooter was nowhere near the party that night. Autopsy would show that Trent was not shot with a handgun. He was shot with a long-range rifle, which would expand the police's search perimeter, and in doing so, they would find evidence underneath a dogwood tree about a block away from the party, where they would find divots in the ground that indicated a rifle bipod stand, and it would have a straight shot to where Trent was sitting on his front porch. This would also allow the shooter to take their shot and pack up and disappear out of sight and out of notice by anybody because of the distance he was away. And that's exactly what happened. And he was able to get away from it for 6 years. Now, over the course of the next few months, dozens of tips would end up coming in toward Trent's case, but nothing substantial. The closest to anything promising is police would end up being turned on to a man who seemed to be very interested in Trent's case. And when they went to his home to search the home, there was notes all over this man's home on Trent's case. But it turned out he just was really obsessed with the case, but he was ruled out as a suspect. He was just a person who was very taken by the case. Now, nobody on campus or within Trent's life could understand who would do something like this. Trent was so well liked, and he had so many friends, and he was a star athlete, and his teachers and his coaches and everybody seemed to really like Trent. And they would get nowhere until January of 2000. Now, in January of 2000, Don Evans, who was the homicide detective that was on Trent's case initially, would receive a phone call from an attorney. By this point, Detective Evans was no longer working in homicide. He had moved to the burglary department, but he was still looking into Trent's case because he was personally involved in it. He was personally tied to it. So he wanted some closure on that case. So despite the fact that he had changed departments, he still maintained his connection to the case. And so when the call from the attorney came in, it came in to Detective Evans. Now, the attorney on the phone would say that he had an anonymous tip from somebody on who they knew to be the one who killed Trent. And that person would be Shane Ragland. And so Detective Evans would get off the phone with the attorney, and he would go through all the files that he had on the case. And he would go through paperwork, and he would go through notes, and he would go through pictures. And after going through everything, he found nothing about a man named Shane Ragland. His name didn't come up anywhere in any interviews, in any roommates, in any friend circles, nothing. Shane Ragland's name was nowhere on any of his notes regarding this case. And so he would call the attorney back and he would try to get more information from the attorney about this anonymous tipster. Now, at the time, the caller did want to remain anonymous, but she did give a little bit more information. And the information that she gave was she was an ex-girlfriend of Shane Ragland's, and the two of them had been out for drinks one night, and the conversation ended up coming up of what is some of the things that you have the biggest regrets on? What is some of the worst things that you have ever done in your life? And through this conversation, Shane had actually admitted to her seeing Trent on his front porch when Shane was on his way home, seeing Trent there, going back to his home, retrieving his rifle, putting it in a duffel bag, going to the area underneath that dogwood tree, setting up his stand, taking his shot on Trent, packing up and fleeing the scene, and admitting to murdering Trent that night. Now, according to her, she was scared to come forward, but she ended up feeling guilt, and that is what made her come forward at that time, 5 years later. So Detective Evans wanted to see if he could confirm any sort of connection to Shane Ragland. And so what he did is he wrote down a list of people's names that would have been in Trent's life. And within this list, he put the name Shane Ragland just randomly in this list of people. And he took that list of people to one of Trent's very best friends, one of his best college friends, Matt Blanford. And he asked Matt if anybody on that list would have any kind of grudge against Trent, if they would have any problem with him, any motive for hurting Trent. And when Matt got to Shane's name, he paused and said that Shane Ragland did have a grudge against Trent. So you remember me saying at the beginning of the video that the reason that Shane committed this murder was such a, in my opinion, dumb reason. We are about to go into the motive that Shane Ragland had for killing Trent DeJaro. And to me, it is so insignificant and so dumb. But this is what Matt Blanford told Detective Evans. When the three men were freshmen in college, Trent and Matt were roommates. They shared a dorm together. And Matt was rushing Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity. Trent was not, but Matt was. Shane Ragland was also rushing the same fraternity. One day, Shane went over to Matt and Trent's dorm and was let inside their dorm room where the three boys were talking to each other. While Shane was in their dorm room, he had noticed a calendar that included various students, various female students from the University of Kentucky on this calendar. And Shane had bragged about sleeping with one of the women on this calendar. And unbeknownst to Shane, the woman that he had bragged about sleeping with was one of the lead officers of the fraternity that he was rushing. And when it got back to that higher up in the fraternity, that Shane was talking about his girlfriend in that kind of way and bragging about how he had slept with her, that officer made the decision to cut Shane from the pledge class. So he was no longer able to rush that fraternity. One day after this had happened, Shane had seen Matt and Trent on campus and had confronted Matt about essentially tattletaling on him. I can't believe you told on me to the higher ups of the fraternity. I'm your pledge brother, and now I can't be in the fraternity. And Trent, being a good guy, like I said, he was a good guy and everybody seemed to like him. He came to his friend's aid and he stood up for his friend and he took the blame and was like, I was the one who told on you. From my understanding, I don't think Trent actually was the one who had turned Shane in for talking about this other guy's girlfriend, but he took the blame for it. And in doing so, had started this unknown feud with Shane, and Shane Ragland just held this grudge against Trent from freshman year for years. Like I said, they were about to enter their third year of college this summer that everything happened, to the point that when Shane was out walking and saw Trent sitting on his porch with a clean shot, he took his shot and killed Trent over this grudge about not being able to get into a fraternity. So like I said, all of this information reignited this cold case that had been cold for like 6 years at this point. All of this information that reignited this cold case all stemmed from this anonymous tipster who was an ex-girlfriend of Shane Ragland's. And it would come out that her name was Amy Lloyd. And she had told the police that she hadn't come forward earlier despite the fact that she had known about this, because she was afraid of Shane and she was worried about what he would do to her if she did come forward. In fact, she kept quiet about it for so long until she had seen a newspaper headline about the 5-year anniversary of the unsolved murder of Trent DeGero. And that had caused her to feel so much guilt that she had decided to call in that anonymous tip. Now, in doing so and having a conversation with the police about what she had known, they wanted to see if they could use her to get a confession out of Shane. And she didn't want to help. She said that she was afraid of Ragland. But they had convinced her that, listen, you do this for us. You help us get a conviction with Shane, and we will set you up with a completely new identity, including a brand new social security number and a home that Shane won't be able to find you in. And with this promise, she agreed to help the police out. And she did this by first emailing back and forth with Shane Ragland, just catching up on life. She had told him that her and her boyfriend had recently split up and just catching up. They ended up switching phone numbers and talking on the phone quite a bit. And through phone conversations, Amy had told Shane, listen, I'm actually going to be in Lexington on business within the next few days, and I would love to get together for a drink. And Shane agreed, and he met her at the airport bar where they had a couple drinks. Now, at this time, Amy was wired. This whole conversation between her and Shane would be recorded and it would be used in court. And in this conversation, Amy had brought up how she had wished that Shane had never told her about him shooting Trent, and that she was having a hard time living with that knowledge. And Shane had admitted to regretting his actions that day. And he said that he regretted doing it and he acted impulsively. And he also thought about it often, but there was essentially nothing he could do about it now. What's done is done. And he even asked Amy, are you setting me up? I feel really suspicious of this conversation. I feel like I'm getting set up. And it would turn out that Shane Ragland would end up being arrested the following day on murder charges. So like I said, Shane would end up getting arrested the following day for Trent's murder, and it would be almost exactly 6 years after Trent's death, because Shane was arrested on July 14th, 2000. And upon his arrest, police would end up searching both his mother and his father's home. They were divorced, so Shane had stuff in a little bit here and a little bit there. And they would end up finding the rifle that matched the description of what would have been used on Trent. And they would also find a box of 243 caliber bullets, which is the bullet that was used to kill Trent. And it's a fairly unique bullet. It's not one that's used as often as others. You know, you hear things like 22, 38. It's a more rare use bullet, which is a pretty big piece of evidence in this case. So at Ragland's trial, Amy Lloyd would testify against Shane, and she would testify with everything that she had told the police thus far, and they would indicate how her testimony had led them down the path of discovering everything that they discovered about Shane Ragland. They would bring in witnesses to testify as far as his motive went, and they would bring in his rifle and that ammunition, and they would bring in forensic experts to talk about the bullets that were used on Trent and the uniqueness of those bullets. Now, obviously, they weren't able to definitively prove that it was this gun and these bullets because so many years had passed, but they could show that the similarities between the gun that Shane had and the gun that was used were pretty significant. After 3 weeks worth of trial, the jury would end up coming back with a guilty verdict, and Shane Ragland would be sentenced to 30 years for the murder of Trent DeJaro. However, our story does not end there, and that is because Shane Ragland had really great defense teams, and they would almost immediately start putting appeals in to overturn Shane's conviction. And it would be from anything from the FBI analyst who was in charge of the bullet was shown to have lied on stage or on the stand. And the judge ruled that it was so insignificant and inconsequential that he rejected that appeal. Then they would come in and say that Shane Ragland's constitutional rights were taken from him because the prosecuting team had used the fact that Shane would not testify against him. And that was also thrown out. But there was one thing that actually stuck. And the thing that stuck was the technology that they used as far as the bullet analysis goes was an outdated technology that had since been retired from use in the FBI, and it was put to pasture because it was so unreliable. And since they had used this to prove their side, and it was proven to be an unreliable testing system, that did end up overturning Shane's conviction. So now we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because the prosecuting team is confident that Shane Ragland had done this. But by this point, they had already followed through on the deal that they had made with Amy Lloyd. And what I mean by that is her name is already changed. She already has a new social security number. She has already moved away, and she's living in her safe house away from Shane Ragland. She is no longer able to testify if they were to do a retrial. And so much of their court proceedings was built around her testimony and where her testimony had taken them through the evidence, that without her, she was such a key witness, their whole case essentially would fall apart. So they worried that without her, he would get an innocent. And so they offered to make a deal with him. And it was the deal of a century, because by this point, Shane had already been serving time, and he had been serving time for 8 years by this point. And so they agreed that if he were to plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter, then he would be sentenced to time served, which is what he did. And after accepting this guilty plea and after having it signed off by the judge, he was a free man. And he walked out of incarceration with a second-degree manslaughter charge. And that's it. Which obviously did not sit right with anybody because of the nature of the crime. It was a planned, coordinated, intentional murder. And he walked out after 8 years of time served. Now, in the time that has passed since then, Shane Ragland has shown that he is still not a great person. He has had several DUIs since then. He has had domestic violence calls on him. He has had a domestic violence restraining order put in against him from his girlfriend and her children. The father of her children was the one who began that process. In 2014, Shane Ragland would be involved in a single car accident, and that left him paralyzed from the waist down. And I couldn't find anything that said for certain, but it did seem as though, since it was a single car accident, obviously it was just his vehicle, and it feels like it was the result of one of his DUIs, but I can't say that with certainty. On a slightly brighter note, Mike DeJaro would end up taking Ragland to civil court. Now, Mike is Trent's father, and he would take Shane Ragland to civil court for a wrongful death lawsuit, and he would end up winning. And not only would he win, he would get a record-breaking win, and he would be awarded $63.3 million in his claim. Now, Ragland would end up putting an appeal to this civil lawsuit claim, not necessarily to overturn the outcome, but to reduce the charge, because $63.3 million is a substantial amount of money. And unfortunately, the jury did end up agreeing with him that it was excessive, and they would reduce the punitive damages portion from that lawsuit from $60 million to $30 million. And so Mike would still get a win. His case would still get a win, and Ragland would still technically be on the hook for over $30 million, but it would be half of the original lawsuit that was awarded to him. Now, Mike doesn't think that he will ever see this money, but he still decided to pursue it on a matter of principle. And so that's why he fought so hard for it. Not because he needed or wanted the money, but because he wanted Shane to have some sort of accountability in his son's death, since the criminal justice system kind of failed him. And that's pretty much it as far as the story goes. It doesn't have a super happy ending. In my opinion, it is another example of flaws within the justice system. I don't feel like somebody should be able to walk after 8 years of doing such a intentional plan, thought of murder, and especially over such a stupid reason. Like, if you snipe someone from a hillside a block away because you think they kept you from getting in a fraternity 3 years ago, that is such a silly little thing to kill someone over, that I would wonder if you would do it again. You know what I mean? Like, it seems like if you are able to do such a cold-blooded act over something so trivial, who's to say that you're not going to do it again? To me, I feel like he should still be in jail, especially he had 6 years free from the time he did it until the time he got arrested, which is bananas to me. But I don't know. I'd love to hear what you think about it. I'd love to hear what you think about the deal that he got, because I feel like it was it was a sweet deal for him, not for any of the victims or the victim's family, but it was a sweet deal for him. And I understand why they did it. I understand that they really needed Amy Lloyd and her testimony and they couldn't get that. But I just don't think that it is, I don't think it's fair. But anyway, I hope that I am back to posting regularly from now on. Like I said, I just needed to have a short, small, little break, and I should be back to regular posting here again now that I've had that little moment to myself. If you want to be notified the next time that I do post, make sure you're subscribed to the channel with the post notification bell turned on. That will notify you every time I post a story, every time I sit down here for another morbid chat. And until that next time, like I always say, take care, stay safe, and I'll talk to you later. All right? Bye.